Greetings there, academic proletariat, and welcome to this episode of the Fireside Chats, where we will be discussing Period 7, the period where Fireside Chats make their debut. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get this started. We're going to start off with a little message to the college board, and we're going to thank the college board for putting all these things in Period 7. Imperialism, Progressive Era, World War I, 1920s, Interwar, Great Depression, New Deal, World War II. It's a mouthful. This video is going to be long, but I want to emphasize that if you need further assistance with any of these things, look back at your notes or, of course, read your book. But it all comes down to a big thank you to the college board, who really should have put imperialism in the Progressive Era in Period 6, but hey, what are we going to do? College board controls everything. Just want to remind you that there's guided notes that go along with it. They're a little bit more open-ended. They allow you to take notes how you want, not necessarily fill in the blank, but a little bit more creative. All right. The bookend dates for Period 7 go like this. 1890 was when the frontier was closed officially in air quotes, and that was evidenced by the massacre at Wounded Knee. The period ends with the end of World War II in 1945. Here are your key concepts. Go ahead and pause me if you want to read them. Otherwise, we're going to read them one by one later. I'm going to go ahead and get this party started with Key Concept 7.1, which says, growth expanded opportunity, while economic instability led to new efforts to reform U.S. society and its economic system. Go ahead and pause me so you can take a chance and rewrite Key Concept 7.1 in your own words. I rewrote Key Concept 7.1 as economic growth continued, but it led to some problems, some really big problems. So let's go ahead and take a look at what those problems and the responses to them were. Key Concept 7.1, Roman numeral 1, the United States continued its transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy led by large companies. If you take a look at the image at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll note that numbers of people living in urban areas was increasing dramatically during the Gilded Age and during the early 1920s, and that's a trend that would continue in American society and eventually in the 1950s with the real massive advent of the suburb. You see those urban numbers continue to rise. So the 1920 census shows us that more people live in urban areas than live in rural ones, and this is due to a number of significant changes. One, the impact of the automobile, which allows for greater mobility. It allows people to get from rural to urban and vice versa. You also see the institution of farming technology, which decreased the need for farm workers in rural areas. So those farm workers look for more opportunities, which they find in cities. And then with this urbanization, you see a number of problems: crime, corruption, inequality, etc. These were things that we talked about in Period 6. You can go back and watch that video if you need a refresher. Key Concept 7.1, Roman numeral 2. In the progressive era of the early 20th century, progressives responded to political corruption, economic instability, and social concerns by calling for greater government action and other political and social measures. So the progressives are responding to those problems created by urbanization, but also other issues as well. So the Progressive Era, if you don't remember, is that time period directly after the Gilded Age, which sought to combat or solve the problems created by the Gilded Age. So we see progressives tackle things like urban issues, like federal issues, and environmental issues. Now I want to make a note that most progressives were upper middle class whites, so there's an element of paternalism here. They see themselves as the vanguards of society. So they think they know what's best for everybody. It's their job to sort of take care of the poor people. Rich man's burden, almost, if you will. Anyways, the answers the progressives had were aimed at reforming the system, not drastically changing it. So you're not going to see them call for the overthrow of capitalism. Most of them are not communists. Most are not socialists. And the College Board loves to ask you if you live in a communist land, which unfortunately you do not. Okay, so how do progressives tackle urban issues? Mostly they did so through a technique known as muckraking. This is where journalists would gather some muck or some bad things going on in society, rake it all together, and then throw it on an unsuspecting group of Americans. So Jacob Riis took pictures and wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. This is one of his pictures, one of the most iconic images from his book. Upton Sinclair, of course, wrote The Jungle, which was an expose of the meatpacking industry. These two things really opened people's eyes to how urbanization had created so many issues in American cities. You also see progressives attack political machines and local corruption through the advent and institution of referendums and recall. These are both political measures sought to allow people to vote on issues and then to get corrupt politicians out of office. And then you also see progressives try to improve the conditions of immigrants. This is most commonly or most famously seen with Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago, Chi-Town Pride. Okay, we also see progressives tackle federal issues. So they try to limit corporate power through the institution of legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, if you recall, was passed in 1890, but really didn't do a lot to curb trusts or big companies because it didn't levy a lot of heavy fines. It wasn't terribly difficult for those corporations to get around it. But hey, it worked on really subverting unions, so that's a win for corporations. We also see progressives tackle race relations. Two of the most famous progressives with regard to race are W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. They had differing ideologies, which you can find elsewhere. We won't discuss it here, but those are two important names to know. Anti-lynching, that crusade was taken up by Ida B. Wells. And then finally, we see some progressives attack poll taxes and literacy tests. Most importantly, however, I would argue is that progressives really seek to curb federal corruption, and most importantly, we see this through the 17th Amendment or the direct election of senators. As shown by the political cartoon on the right, the Senate had been controlled by these big businesses for a while, and direct election of those senators really is a step in the right direction of curbing that. All right, so next we see progressives try and tackle environment issues. So you can imagine the Gilded Age took a toll on America's environment, really try to exhume as many resources from the bowels of the earth as they could. And we see two groups try and step up and stop this. First, we have the less intense conservationists. Teddy Roosevelt is the most iconic example of this. He helps push through the Antiquities Act in 1906, which helps protect places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite. Eventually morphs into the National Park Service in the 19-teens. An example of conservation gone wrong is the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, which involves a Teddy Roosevelt appointee being fired by William Howard Taft for getting in the way of the selling of conserved or conservation land. And so this makes Teddy Roosevelt mad, which is why he comes back, and it's just a big mess. Anyways, the Ballinger-Pinchot affair is an example of conservationists really standing their ground, but still losing to the interests of big business. On the other side of the coin, you have preservationists, who are those people that want to see the land not touched at all. Conservationists are okay if the land is used for good reasons. Preservationists want to see it not touched at all. They are headed by John Muir, who is the leader of the Sierra Club. He's pictured right here with this Fabo beard. Okay, so now I want to just really quickly go over how progressives are thought about. Now, most people see them as, positive. They advocated change, but how much change did they really advocate? Did they advocate that much change with immigrants? Some people did, like Jane Addams. However, some progressives wanted to restrict immigration and wanted immigrants to assimilate. That sort of restricts freedom. How they do on race relations? Some advocated segregation as a solution. How they do on temperance? Well, temperance really isn't freedom. So are the progressives really providing freedom? And then finally, how they do on government? Well, some argue that instead of government intervening, we should have experts intervene. And this is where we get the growth of people like Frederick Taylor and his idea of scientific management, which really goes against workers in the workplace and rather turns every workplace into somewhat of an assembly line. So progressives are kind of a mixed bag. They don't always go one way, and there are multiple ways to think of them. And, progressive implies progress. And did we really progress that much? Some might argue not, which leads us to key concept 7.1, Roman numeral 3. During the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. So you might be thinking to yourself, what does this relate to the progressives? Well, the New Deal is an offshoot or a continuation of the progressive era. So I can see why the College Board would put these two things together. I can also see them asking you something that compares and contrasts or bring these two ideas together. Okay, before we talk New Deal, we have to talk Great Depression. So the Great Depression was caused by a number of different things, not just a stock market crash. In fact, I would argue that the stock market crash sort of plays a backseat to things like overproduction in agriculture, buying on margin on the whole, not just in the stock market, but the stock market was pretty bad. And then the two most important causes of the Great Depression are bank failures which really caused people to be very conservative and very careful with their money, which leads to less investment in businesses. And then finally, the loss of consumer demand, which of course is bad because the less consumer demand you have, the less products are being made and less people have jobs. Now, affects, as you can probably imagine, mass unemployment, loss of consumer confidence, hard times, as evidenced by these little kids who are trying to get their dad a job. Okay, so response to the Great Depression, FDR pledges a New Deal, which is considered a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the American citizens. If you're in my class and you get an essay on the New Deal, the term fundamental shift should end up in it. It'll make you sound oh so smart. Okay, now, when remembering the New Deal, there's a lot of stuff to remember, which is indicated by this political cartoon here, and FDR sort of playing around on the playground with his alphabet agencies. So you don't need to remember all the agencies, but let's try and break the New Deal down into 3 phases. The first phase, that of relief. So in the first 100 days, FDR intended to relieve suffering through things like banking reform, through things like institution of federal job programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, things like that. Now, before I go any further, I will say that, if you're from other classes, some of your teachers might have put these things into different phases of the New Deal, and they can go into many. This is how I'm going to suggest it. It's not right. It's not wrong. If you heard it in another way, there's some subjectivity here. Okay, the second phase, recovery, which was intended to restore the economy back to how it was before the Depression. This is evidenced by things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which sought to fix farming by controlling how much farmers make. The National Industrial Recovery Act, which sought to reduce competition and really worked against small business owners, but it sought to reduce competition to sort of stabilize prices and to encourage businesses to hire more people. And then the last phase of the New Deal, reform, the third and the longest phase, was intended to prevent future depression. So this is evidenced or supported by the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Agency. Social Security, of course, extended benefits to unemployed and elderly Americans. The Wagner Act, which is my favorite act in American history, made it safe and made it legal for workers to unionize. Companies couldn't come after them for being in a union. And the FDIC was a program designed to protect people's bank assets because after the bank failures, people were kind of nervous. Now, the New Deal did not come without criticism. In fact, the critics of the New Deal is an important part of understanding the New Deal and its importance in American history. There were critics on both sides. Conservative critics included Congress and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court really worked to undermine several New Deal agencies, including the AAA and the NRA. Now, to combat this, FDR sought to pack the court, or to put more judges on the court that were friendly to him, as you can see by this cartoon to the right, which not so favorable of FDR, and it didn't work. FDR failed at this, but it just goes to show you that the government itself wasn't ready for this type of change. Then you had critics on the other side who wanted more out of FDR. So you had Dr. Francis Townsend, who was the brainchild for Social Security, and he wanted FDR to do more than just what had been passed. Huey Long, of course, is FDR's most intense critic and the most dangerous to FDR, according to FDR himself. He came up with the Share Our Wealth program, which advocated for 100% income tax on incomes over $1 million. He really wanted to redistribute the wealth, but he was kind of going down the fascist route to get there. Kind of scary. And then another guy who went a little cuckoo was Father Coughlin. He wanted FDR to take over banks instead of just giving them a holiday, but he started to advocate some really loopy things and became very anti-Semitic. Eventually, the bishop in his archdiocese made him stop talking, and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, you have critics on both sides of the New Deal, and the New Deal really was sort of attacked on the conservative side, and those conservatives have had a lot of success in curbing just how far the New Deal could go. Now, the New Deal leaves an important legacy in American history, and it's one that continues on to today. The New Deal realigned the Democratic Party. So it brought into the Democratic Party the likes of Black Americans who had voted reliably Republican for years before this because Lincoln was a Republican, so they voted for him. But FDR and his extension of benefits is going to bring Black Americans, despite the fact that he didn't pass an anti-lynch bill, but that's another story. It's going to bring Black Americans into the Democratic Party. The working class who are sort of empowered by the Wagner Act come into the Democratic Party. Small farmers who like the idea of the AAA, even the AAA really served big farmers more, come into the Democratic Party. The elderly because of Social Security, the recent immigrants because of various work programs, all come into the Democratic Party. So it gives the Democratic Party a new face for a long time. And then on a more broad scope, the New Deal initiated a period of government spending, or Keynesian economics. And this government involvement altered the meaning of liberalism. Liberalism is a vague term intended to describe people's freedom. So before the New Deal, people were free from government. And after the New Deal, freedom is going to be supported by government. So that's the New Deal in a nutshell. That could have been a video all in itself. I realize this video is kind of long. If you want to pause it and take a break, come back later, I don't blame you. Okay, we're going to move on to Key Concept 7.2, which is a little bit shorter. Innovations in communications and technology contributed to the growth of mass culture, while significant changes occurred in internal and international migration patterns. Go ahead and pause me so you can rewrite Key Concept 7.2 in your own words, and come back when you're done. I rewrote Key Concept 7.2 in my own words by saying that technology drastically changed American lives and where they live. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that in two Roman numerals. Key Concept 7.2, Roman numeral 1, popular culture grew in influence in U.S. society, even as debates increased over the effects of culture on public values, morals, and American national identity. So we're talking national identity here. This is good stuff. National identity was shaped by technological innovation like the radio. Ideas are able to get out to a lot of people at once. You can make people follow the same ideas. You can bring them together. Same thing with the cinema. And then the car, which of course changed people's ability to move around, that helped create a national culture as well. Cars really impacted Americans, changed their lives, changed the whole scope of America. Now, each of those things contributed to a spread of a national culture, and also contributed to regional cultures as well, but it's that national culture that we really want to focus in on here. So let's talk about the effects of World War I on national identity. First, World War I saw the restrictions on freedom of speech, best evidenced by the Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States, which argued that it is okay for the government to limit dissenters during wartime or during crisis. And then the Committee on Public Information, which really sought to sort of impact Americans psychologically and put out a lot of propaganda that got people to support the war efforts. That hadn't really been done before. World War I also saw in its aftermath the first Red Scare, and because Russia had its revolution and there were a lot of immigrants coming into the United States, people started to question whether there were communists among us. And Attorney General for the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, had his house bombed. We don't know by who, but as a result of that, he led a series of raids on communists, but it really contributed to an anti-communist sentiment among Americans, and that anti-communist sentiment has, of course, lived on. And then finally, the Great Migration, which we'll come back to and talk to in a little bit, was the massive influx of Black Americans who moved north to urban areas in search of jobs. This is a sort of migration that's going on during the time period. Now, national culture is incredibly influenced by the 1920s, and the 1920s is often seen as a period of roar or the Roaring Twenties. However, we're going to get you to try and rethink that as we discuss here. So, what made it roaring? Well, it was the modern era. People started to do things that were very modern. You see modern art, you see modern dancing, you see modern music. Jazz is a good example of the modern era. People started to buy stuff on credit, which means buying things that they can't afford. We see a change in the roles of women. The 19th Amendment allowed women to vote, and that really brought on a sense of freedom and autonomy among the women, who started to flap, as seen with the two ladies on our right. We see evolution making a big impact on America, best evidenced by the Scopes trial, where John T. Scopes tried to teach evolution in Tennessee school and was brought to trial for it. Urbanization is roaring. Speakeasies to sell illegal alcohol is roaring. The Harlem Renaissance, Black people actually having, cultural Success and uplift is roaring. Lost Generation, The Great Gatsby is roaring. Entertainment and heroes, Charles Lindbergh, Babe Ruth. All of these things are roaring. These are new things that are really leading to an burgeoning culture in America. Now, on the flip side, we have to look at the 1920s as also reactionary. We have a series of Republican presidents who are quite taciturn and kind of boring. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover are all very pro-business. They don't have a lot of personality, and they sort of stay out of the way. So government is getting smaller. We see this by way of laissez-faire or supply-side economics, which is supported during the 1920s. High tariffs, low taxes, not a lot of government involvement. We see nativism and racism during the 1920s. Immigration quotas is evidenced by the political cartoon to the right. We're going to come back and talk about those in a second. We also see the resurgence of the KKK, which grew in numbers. Its main state, Indiana, had a huge outpouring of support. It's kind of scary. Even evangelism, which of course led to the Scopes trial, and then diplomatic isolationism, which we will discuss in Key Concept 7.3. All right, Key Concept 7.2. Roman numeral 2, economic pressures, global events, and political developments cause sharp variations in the numbers, sources, and experiences of both international and internal migrants. So we're talking migrations here. So demographic changes that occurred during this Key Concepts time period. We see an increased immigration during the Gilded Age, and that really gets Native Americans, and I say Native in air quotes, so white Americans scared, and so they pressure Congress to pass the Emergency Quota Act in 1921 and the National Origins Act in 1924 to close the gates. We want to put a limit on how many immigrants are able to come into the country. Now, this is not really good for economies because immigrants do a lot of needed work, but hey, whiteness. All right, the Great Migration is another influential migration during this time period. Like we said before, it's the movement of blacks to urban centers in search of jobs. They just couldn't handle the sharecropping anymore. Now it leads to an emergence of black areas in the north, Harlem being sort of the black capital of America. Now, important to note that blacks are not moving north because they think that the north is a place of racial solidarity. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think that they pretty much know and understand that they're entering to a hotbed of racism, and this racism was best evidenced by the Chicago race riot in 1919. Not so much Chi-Town pride. Okay. Key Concept 7.3, we're going to discuss participation in a series of global conflicts propelled and how those conflicts propelled the United States into a position of international power while renewing domestic debates over the nation's proper role in the world. So we're talking war. Go ahead and pause me, write Key Concept 7.3, and don't steal mine that just mistakenly made its way onto the screen. I rewrote Key Concept 7.3 to accommodate economic growth. America entered into a series of imperial and world conflicts, which increased its role in the world. So basically, to facilitate capitalism, America has to shoot people. All right, Key Concept 7.3, Roman numeral 1. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, new U.S. territorial ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific accompanied heightened public debates over America's role in the world. So we're talking imperialism, people. Imperialism is what happens when a stronger country takes over and subjects a weaker area to colonial rule. Causes of imperialism for America are the crisis over the loss of the frontier. Oh my God, what are we going to do now? We can't expand anymore. We got to look elsewhere. The desire to obtain access to raw materials, which the United States has plenty of, but I guess we needed more. The desire to keep up with other nations, which is evidenced by this political cartoon to the right, one of Mr. Prezier's favorites. So if you had him, you can tell him you saw it. And then the desire to keep markets open for American goods. We wanted to be able to sell our awesome stuff, which was really crap. We wanted to sell our crappy stuff, which means we needed to keep places who would buy it open. Okay, so here are examples of American imperialism, and the best example is Manifest Destiny, which of course happened in the mid-1800s, not during this time period, but still have to look at it as imperialism. Sorry if you're an American exceptionalist, you probably hate me. First, we're going to talk Hawaii, and Hawaii really came to a head in the early 1890s, around 1892-93, when American sugar and fruit plantation owners like Sanford Dole, the banana guy, take over the island with the support of American Marines. Now, this is just going to be the tip of the iceberg, because in 1898, which is one of the most important turning points in the AP US course is the Spanish-American War, which turns America into a colonial power. America enters the war to protect Cuba from Spain, but ends up with colonies in addition to protecting Cuba from Spain. We really don't protect Cuba, or we protect Cuba from Spain, but we don't protect Cuba from us, and we sort of impose a series of rules on Cuba. Is ridiculous. Okay, anyways, we get colonies in places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Now, this leads us into involvement in areas in the world, notably the Philippines, which the Filipinos fight with Americans to get the Spanish out, but then Americans don't leave, so the Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, start to fight us. A lot of death, a lot of destruction. America prevails physically, but, our image is tarnished, and psychologically, we should be screwed up. Now, also in Asia, we seek to establish what we call an open door policy in China, meaning everybody should be able to trade equally. We don't want any European powers to colonize China, because if China's colonized, then we're essentially trading with the colonizers. We want China to stay open because apparently China loved buying our stuff. How things have changed. Okay. We also exert our imperial influence in Latin America, best evidenced by Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy. Speak softly, carry a big stick, and basically get Latin American countries to do what we want with intimidation. This is best exemplified by what happened with the Panama Canal. Panama had been controlled by Colombia, and we basically sail a bunch of big boats down there and force the Colombians out so that Panama can become independent, because we know if Panama is independent, it will sell us land or provide land to build a canal, which we eventually build. It's finished in 1914 and allows a lot of ships to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific without having to go around South America. William Howard Taft institutes a policy towards Latin America called dollar diplomacy, not big stick anymore, but dollar. I think you can probably get the gist of what that means, but basically dollar diplomacy is the idea that we are going to foster relationships with Latin America that encourage American businesses. And then Woodrow Wilson's missionary diplomacy or moral diplomacy is all about making Latin Americans moral. We want to make sure that they have good democratic governments, and when they don't, we'll shoot them, like what happened with the chaos in the early 19-teens, which encourages Pancho Villa to come over the border, kill some Americans, and then Wilson sends a bunch of people after him, and he's a good bandit. He really was on the run for a while. In fact, we never caught him. Go Pancho. Love him. Okay, now this imperialism, as you can probably imagine, caused a lot of negative views of America, and you see anti-imperialism becoming an important voice. The Anti-Imperialist League is a group that represented these anti-imperialist voices, and anti-imperialist voices included Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan, Jane Addams. Not all of them were in the Anti-Imperialist League, but they had sentiments that were congruent with those of the Anti-Imperialist League. And those arguments are that imperialism is expensive, it contradicts the Constitution because it doesn't allow other countries to be free. There's racism involved, saying that why would we want to conquer the Philippines because there's like Filipinos there and they're not white. Why do we want to do that? So not all these anti-imperialist arguments are really that moral. It causes death. It's bad for American farmers and American manufacturers. We should just stay out of the whole imperialism thing. Despite these voices and quite intelligent voices to say the least, people don't listen. And our imperialism is going to eventually lead us into key concept 7.3, Roman numeral 2, World War I and its aftermath, intensified ongoing debates about the nation's role in the world and how best to achieve national security and pursue American interests. So let's talk World War I. America abandoned its initial neutrality and involved itself in World War I because Germany is being aggressive on the high seas. Of course, they blow up the Lusitania, but that's not the reason America gets involved in World War I. The Lusitania was sunk in 1915. America doesn't get involved until 1917. If it really made us that angry, we would have gotten involved a lot earlier. More importantly, we want to protect our investments that we've put into allied countries like Britain, and we want to reserve a seat at the post-war peace talks. Those are the major reasons we get involved in World War I. So you see us becoming more involved because of imperialism, and then all of a sudden we enter wars in order to create a world that we want. Kind of weird. Anyways, we enter the war in 1917, we win the war in 1918, America is awesome. Now, World War I has fundamental effects, or really important effects on the home front. The government controls ideas, as evidenced by the Committee on Public Information. It also creates a lot of propaganda that leads to anti-German sentiment, as evidenced by this poster right here. We also see hamburgers being renamed Liberty sandwiches, and French fries, freedom, or no, not French fries, sauerkraut, which is Liberty cabbage. It's just it's ridiculous. So, anyways, yeah, the government controls our ideas. Big Brother is watching. The government also controls money. They encourage Americans to buy Liberty bonds, and they control industry. They create the War Industries Board, which sets quotas on how much people are, or how much companies are able to make. It sets price limits and puts regulations on workers, and tries to avoid strikes at all costs. Anyways, the government, as it does in all wars, becomes a lot more involved. Now, the most important thing to understand about World War I is the aftermath and what happened at the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson shows up to talk peace with 14 points. 4 of them were self-determination, governments being able to, or countries being able to choose their own form of government. That's funny. Freedom of the seas, no secret alliances, and of course a League of Nations. There's 10 other ones, but hey, 4 is a good start. Now, the most important one to Woodrow Wilson is the League of Nations. The League of Nations contains several articles, the most important of which is Article 10, which is collective security. It basically says that if one country in the League of Nations is attacked, the rest of the League of Nations will go to war in support of that country. Now, this makes the Senate mad, and they refuse to ratify the treaty because of that collective security clause. As you can see by the cartoon to the right, Woodrow Wilson was all ready to get America and put America in a position to be heavily involved in foreign affairs, and the Senate breaks in and stops him from doing it. It's very complicated. That's sort of a reductionist explanation of it, but what you should know is this sort of sets off a period of limited isolation. And during the interwar period, America leans isolationist, but is never truly isolationist. So we see them in as early as 1920-21 at the Washington Naval Conference, which limits the amount of battleships countries are allowed to have. We see America sort of, leading international conferences. This is not isolationist. This is very interventionist, in fact. We see America passing neutrality acts, which, despite the name, the neutrality acts have certain loopholes in them, which allow America to be involved. We see America pass a cash and carry policy, which allows us to trade with belligerent powers. We then see the Lend-Lease Act, which allows us to lend things and just tell not our allies yet, but tell Britain, tell France, oh, you can pay us later, right? So the build up to World War II, we really see isolation is kind of there, but not really there for very long. And then finally, of course, America gets involved after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, America in World War II, there's a lot that you could know about World War II. For our purposes, we're going to talk about 3 things. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944 is when America directly invades Europe at a place that matters. We had invaded Sicily and Italy earlier in 1943. However, there wasn't really a lot of Nazi troops there. The Nazis had fortified Western France, and so to open up that front was a big deal. Finally, did what the Russians wanted us to do. However, it was too late to salvage that relationship. Nevertheless, D-Day is an important day in American history. Now, with regard to the Pacific, there are several islands and several battles, which is evidenced by the map that we have to the right. But I want to talk about the strategy that was employed in the Pacific. It was called island hopping. And basically, American troops went from island to island to island, trying to get closer to mainland Japan. And then finally, once we were right on the doorstep of mainland Japan, President Truman authorizes the dropping of the atomic bombs on August 6 and August 9, 1945, thus bringing the war to an end. More important, though, just like in World War I, is what happened at home during World War II. So World War II had profound impacts on several groups of Americans. So we're going to look at the different groups that were impacted by World War II. Black Americans were impacted in somewhat of a positive way. You see President Roosevelt passed Executive Order 8802, which creates a Fair Employment Practices Commission or committee, which doesn't mandate employers to hire black people, but if you have a record against you, then you can't get any government contracts. So it really urges compliance with anti-discrimination measures, but doesn't force it, which is, kind of short of what it should have been, but a step in the right direction, I guess. The big idea driving black Americans during World War II was the Double V campaign. Victory abroad. We want to beat the Nazis. We want to beat that kind of racism and that kind of challenge, those kind of the challenges to freedom. But then we also want to do the same thing at home, because America is essentially contradicting itself. If it's fighting the Nazis because the Nazis are not free people, then how come black Americans can't get rights in America? So they seek to expose that hypocrisy through the Double V campaign. Another example of hypocrisy during World War II was with Japanese Americans, which, of course, are legendarily forced into internment camps via Executive Order 9066, which cited protection of the West Coast against the Japanese. There really weren't that many Japanese to even be concerned about, but President Roosevelt passes the executive order anyways. I think it puts a lot of Americans at peace of mind, unless you were Japanese. Mexican Americans also treated with discrimination during World War II, despite their working in large numbers via the Bracero program, which was a program which brought migrant workers from Mexico to work in agricultural jobs during World War II. But you see them in places like California be discriminated against. The most iconic example of this is the Zoot Suit riots, in which several Mexican Americans were wearing their signature suits called Zoot Suits, and they were attacked by a group of American sailors, and which caused this riot in Los Angeles. Women, of course, are represented by Rosie the Riveter. If I want you to know one thing about women during World War II, is that most women that were working were women that had already been working, and then they get better jobs during the war because men left those jobs, or those jobs had been opened up, but then when the war is over, women lose them all. So women basically are used and abused for a couple of years, and once the war is over, they're sent packing to where they were, wherever they were before the war started. And finally, consumers, much like World War I, there's a lot of parallels here, but rationing and government regulation of products, prices, and workers and strikes occurred during World War II as well, on a larger scale than did World War I. So that's going to bring us almost to the end, but I want to celebrate America being back-to-back World War champs. Not really, because the Soviets took the brunt in both wars, and really in World War II, if the Soviets didn't fight in it, we would have lost. Anyways, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to remind you, America is the world's highest standard of living. Peace.